Why did a place long considered empty and dead for centuries turn out to be one of the most alive and most dangerously changing spaces in all of Russia? Our ancestors did not avoid the Vasyugan Swamps in Western Siberia by accident. For a long time, this land seemed devoid of life, too remote, too wet, too impassable. It was no coincidence that from 1835 onward, people were exiled here whom they wanted to literally erase from the world of the living. But this place holds a memory far older than any exile. The Vasyugan Swamps cover 53,000 square kilometers. That is larger than Denmark, larger than Switzerland, and at the same time it is about 2% of all northern-type swamps on the planet. The scale is enormous, and yet it remains astonishingly little studied. In summer it is almost impossible to get through here. Equipment sinks. In winter, temperatures drop to -35 degrees. A significant part of the territory has seen neither an archaeologist nor a full scientific expedition. It is as if the swamp itself decides whom to let in and whom to keep out. And the most important thing is that the Vasyugan Swamps do not stand still. This is not a frozen bog. It is a living mass that is slowly but inevitably growing. About 10,000 years ago, there was forest steppe here. Then the bogging process began. At first, separate swampy areas appeared. There were 19 of them. Then they merged into a single expanse. Over the last 500 years, the swamp has grown by about 4 times. Now it takes in another 800 hectares of dry land every year. Not because of rivers, not because of dams. The reason is sphagnum moss. It is this moss that creates new peat, holds moisture, and step by step turns solid ground into quaking mire. The pattern is almost always the same. First the land grows wetter. Then the moss arrives, then the bog appears, and once this process begins, it cannot be reversed. Peat grows slowly, about 1 millimeter a year, but its power lies in that slowness. 11 centimeters of peat can preserve about 100 years of history, and the maximum depth of the deposits here reaches 10 meters. That means the lowest layers remember the age when the last mammoth still wandered across northern Eurasia. In essence, Vasyugan lays down time layer by layer, year by year, century by century. Scientists believe that if growth continues at the same pace, in a few centuries the swamp will reach territories where settlements still stand today, and this process is already visible. Villages along the edges are emptying out, not only because of economic hardship. The very ground beneath them is becoming softer and wetter with each passing decade. In 1968, archaeologists surveyed the banks of the Varenga and Gai rivers, tributaries of the Vasyugan. They were not expecting a sensation. It was a routine reconnaissance. But it was there that they found bronze masks later called the Vasyuganya visages. Based on ceramics from the same layer, their age was estimated at about 2,500 years. Archaeologist Lyudmila Chindina devoted a separate study to these finds. According to one of her theories, such visages may have served as a vessel for the soul of the deceased. They were placed beside the dead, so that the spirit would not wander through the swamp. But the mystery turned out to be deeper. It is unclear who exactly made these masks. Outwardly, they resemble the Relka-type examples known in the archaeology of Western Siberia. However, their casting method is different. No precisely identified culture of that time matches them completely. Some researchers consider them shamanic objects. Others see them as parts of ritual dolls or amulets. There is no answer, and perhaps it lies very close by. Near the place where they were found stood a burial mound. It was never opened. The swamp cut off access to it. In summer, equipment cannot be brought there. The soil is loose. The peat gives way. Insects turn the work into torture. In winter, the frost and short daylight hours get in the way. Chindina wrote plainly that a full expedition could clarify much, but it still has not happened. By the way, if details like these interest you, subscribe to the channel. Here we examine not myths, but real mysteries that science has not yet had time to fully explain. And in that sense, Vasyugan is almost perfect. Among the indigenous people of these places, the Selkups, there is an image that stands out even against the backdrop of rich Siberian mythology. It is Shalab-Kup, a being of evil origin, but it does not have a single body. It has 3 forms: a bear, a giant eagle with feathers like knives, and a colossal serpent. Transformations are not uncommon in the myths of Siberia, but such a combination of forms and such powerful symbolism are extremely rare. Some details of this image have no exact parallels at all in neighboring traditions. And this is not just a fairy tale recorded by ethnographers. In 1958, near the village of Staraya Ugina, on the Vasyugan River, a hoard of 7th century bronze objects was found. 17 items in all. One of them depicted a bear standing on its hind legs, holding a humanoid creature in its front paws. Researchers linked this image specifically to Shalab Kup. So what we have before us is not a late legend, but a trace of an ancient cult, more than 1,000 years old. And this is not an isolated find. Similar images have been discovered elsewhere as well. Near Tomsk on the bank of the Malaya Kyrgyzska, on the Tartus River, the image of a bear holding a human appears again and again. That means we are dealing not with a local tale from a single village, but with a widespread and enduring cult that lived in the region for centuries. There is also another curious version. Some linguists connect the name Vasyugan with an ancient root that may have meant monster or serpent. If so, then the creature's name may have been embedded in the very name of the river and the swamp. People literally named the place after the one they feared here. The Selkups themselves also long remained a mystery to science. They are one of the small indigenous peoples of Siberia, preserved on the edges of the swamp. Research has shown that their cultural roots go very deep and lead back to the Pezeric culture of Altai. These were nomads who lived between the 6th and 3rd centuries BC. It was the Pezerics who left behind the famous frozen burial mounds of Altai. In them, fabrics, ornaments, food, the bodies of the dead, and even tattoos on skin were preserved. Their world was connected both with the steppes of Central Asia and with Iranian cultural influences. Through centuries of migrations and mixing, echoes of this tradition reached the edge of the Vasyugan mire. Hence the special attitude toward the bear. For the Selkups, it is not just an animal. It is almost a relative of man, sometimes even a vessel for the souls of ancestors. If a bear attacked a person, the blame could be explained not by the beast's malice, but by some wrongdoing of the victim. The 18th century author Grigory Novitsky wrote that among the Samoyedic peoples, a bearskin was given almost sacred honors. They sang before it, they danced before it, they kissed it with respect. This is not everyday fear. It is a trace of an ancient religion. And yet one of Vasyugan's main secrets is hidden not in myths, but in the peat itself. It grows by about 1 millimeter a year, slower than human fingernails, but that is precisely why the peat mass works like an almost perfect archive. It preserves plant pollen, spores of ancient fungi, animal remains, traces of climate, and things that people lost thousands of years ago. Each layer records its own era, and a 10-meter thickness holds about 10,000 years of continuous natural chronicle. Scientists have found in these layers seeds of plants that disappeared after the Ice Age, and microorganisms that survived ancient glaciation cycles. Some of them, under certain conditions, retain the ability to reactivate. This means that the swamp preserves not only dead traces of the past, but also biological material that has almost vanished elsewhere on the planet. From these finds, it is possible to reconstruct what the flora of Siberia was like before the last glacier retreated. And despite all this, most of the peat chronicle still remains unread. Reaching the deep layers is difficult. Boreholes quickly collapse. The peat compresses. The work requires months, complex equipment, and a great deal of luck. So the most honest answer to the question of what else Vasyugan holds is very simple. We do not know, but something else is known. 1 hectare of the Vasyugan swamp is capable of absorbing carbon dioxide many times more actively than a hectare of forest of the same size. In other words, what we have before us is not a useless bog, as people once thought, but a gigantic living system. It preserves the climatic history of the Earth, hides traces of ancient cults, conserves biological forms from the distant past, and slowly changes the map of Siberia right before our eyes. In a single year, this swamp binds from 3 to 10 million tons of carbon dioxide. At the same time, it produces about 4 million tons of oxygen. More than 1 billion tons of carbon are locked in its peat deposits. This reserve accumulated over millennia, and all that time it hardly returned to the atmosphere. That is why the swamp here is not just a landscape. It is an enormous natural mechanism that helps keep the climate in balance. But this system has another side as well. The swamp does not only absorb carbon dioxide, it also releases methane, and methane affects the climate about 25 times more strongly. It is released especially actively where the swamp is heavily waterlogged. In summer, this can literally be seen with the naked eye. Gas bubbles break through the water in entire columns. Such emissions were recorded by Tom scientists from the Institute of Monitoring of Climatic and Ecological Systems. For now, the balance remains in favor of absorption. But only as long as the swamp is alive and saturated with water. If the peatlands dry out or catch fire, the picture will change instantly. Then the carbon that has been accumulating here for centuries and millennia will begin returning to the atmosphere. Scientists call this a carbon bomb. The Vasyugan Swamp alone, if seriously degraded, is capable of releasing so much carbon dioxide that the entire climate of the northern hemisphere would feel it. And the most dangerous thing here is not open flame. Peat fires burn from within, deep in the layers. They smolder for weeks and months. They are hard to notice right away, and almost impossible to extinguish completely. The swamp here does not simply live. It literally regulates the planet. Since the 19th century, this region had another significance as well. From 1835, the Narum region officially became a place of exile. Decembrists were sent here, then revolutionaries, then old believers. The swamp turned into a prison without walls. There was almost nowhere to run. It was impossible to reach inhabited places. Nature held people more reliably than any guard, but even earlier those who sought isolation of their own accord came here. In 1882, officials of Tomsk Governorate were conducting a census and came across a settlement of old believers deep in the region. There turned out to be 725 of them. They had been living there since the beginning of the 19th century, completely separate from the outside world. During that time, the people had managed to build houses, plow fields, acquire livestock, open a school, and here is the most astonishing part. Almost no one knew about them. They themselves chose the most inaccessible place so that the authorities would not find them. It was possible to get there only by river and only during the short navigation season. In winter, the route was effectively closed. The swamp sheltered them for decades. During that time, generations of people grew up who had never once seen a city and had no idea how much the outside world had changed. By the way, if details like these interest you, subscribe to the channel. Here we examine not only the loud headline-making facts, but also what usually remains between the lines of history. In the middle of the 20th century, this region revealed another side of itself. In 1949, then they discovered new deposits. By the 1970s, there were already more than 30 of them. The territory that had long been considered useless and unsuitable for economic activity turned out to be part of one of the country's largest oil and gas basins. It was no accident that it was nicknamed the Oil Klondike. Heavy machinery came here. Roads were laid through the peat. Oil and gas pipelines were built. The settlement of Novi Vasyugan appeared. Gas began to be supplied to Tomsk Oblast and Kuzbas. But for the local indigenous peoples, the Selkups and Khanty, that gas often passed them by. The pipes ran near their settlements, but not for them. The price of extraction proved high. Tracked vehicles destroyed the upper moss layer, and it is precisely this layer that retains moisture and sustains the life of the swamp. Pipelines ruptured. Oil spread across the peat ridges. Researchers recorded the accumulation of heavy metals, including lead and cadmium. Later, much of the territory had to be closed off as protected land, but damaged areas can no longer simply be returned to their former state. There is yet another layer to this story, quite literally a layer beneath our feet. In the peat bogs of Europe and Britain, Ireland, Denmark, and the Netherlands, so-called bog bodies are regularly found. These are bodies that have been preserved in peat for thousands of years. The reason lies in the special conditions: an acidic environment, almost complete absence of oxygen, and the properties of sphagnum moss, which slows the decomposition of organic matter. Thanks to this, the finds preserve skin, hair, and even stomach contents. Scientists can determine what a person ate on the last day of life. Most such finds date to the period from the 1st century BC to the 4th century AD. The Vasyugan Swamps are very similar to the European ones in terms of preservation conditions, but in scale they are many times larger. This is the largest peat massif in the world, and that is exactly why the question is especially important. What is hidden in its layers? Bones of ancient animals, seeds of vanished plants, bronze objects of unknown cultures. All of this has already been found by chance, but there have been almost no systematic excavations here. In summer, it is difficult to get there. In winter, Frost down to -35 degrees and frozen peat get in the way. So no one fully knows what exactly lies beneath this surface, in perfect preservation, for thousands of years already. And this is not the only modern threat. The territory of the swamps partially falls within the calculated impact zones of launch vehicle stages sent up from the Baikonur Cosmodrome. Along with the fragments, fuel residue falls as well. We are talking about heptyl. That is unsymmetrical dimethylhydrazine, a substance of the highest hazard class. It is toxic. It damages the liver and the central nervous system. It can accumulate in food chains. Fuel residues settle into the peat and enter the water. And yet the swamp here works like a giant natural filter. It provides water to dozens of Siberian rivers. And if toxic substances enter its layers, they do not disappear without a trace. They can slowly move onward into bodies of water and living organisms. The long-term consequences have not been fully studied, simply because most of the impact sites are extremely difficult to reach and conduct regular observations there. Villages on the edges of such zones gradually emptied out. First the young people left, then the rest. Some settlements became abandoned. In 2017, a federal nature reserve was established here, but it covers only part of the enormous massif. Its area is a little more than 600,000 hectares. While the entire swamp massif occupies about 5.5 million hectares, that means only about 1/9 is under strict protection. Entry into the reserve is prohibited, without a special permit, and the accompaniment of a state inspector. You cannot simply come for berries. You cannot fish. You cannot hunt. You cannot even walk there without permission. And the reason is clear. The ecosystem here is extremely fragile. Scientists warn that it can be disrupted even by one careless step, and the consequences may prove irreversible. All the rest of the space is formally open, but in practice it remains almost inaccessible. 8/9 of this territory still remain a true terra incognita. Many rivers that pass through the swamp have still not been properly surveyed. And this is perhaps the strongest impression left by the whole story. Before us is not a remnant of wild nature, but a gigantic living system. It holds carbon, preserves traces of vanished eras, takes the blows of industry and the space age upon itself. And at the same time it still hides more about itself than we have yet managed to learn. Most of the shorelines here remain unexplored to this day. And that is no exaggeration. Near the Varan and Gai rivers, a burial mound and masks were found back in 1968, but the mound itself was never excavated. More than half a century has passed. We know only the edges of this story. In the layers near the swamps, traces of the Ustardus, Odinovo, and Krotovo cultures were found. These were people who lived here in the 16th and 10th centuries BC, but archaeologists have mostly studied only the outskirts. The center of the swamp is almost silent. What was there? What rituals did they perform? Where did these tribes go? Why did they disappear? There are still no answers. And time is running out. The swamp grows every year. It takes in about 800 more hectares of land, along with grass, forest, and traces of the past. In 100 years, some of the places that can still be studied will disappear beneath a layer of peat, first under one, then under the next, and then access to these traces may be lost forever. The Vasyugan Swamps have preserved history for 10,000 years. Beneath our feet lie the belongings of peoples whose names we do not even know. Some things have been described and entered into reports, but we still have not been able to fully understand everything. The swamp is in no hurry to reveal its secrets. It simply waits, and at the same time it erases what man has not yet managed to reach. Thank you for watching. Subscribe to the channel and leave a like. See you again soon.